The morning light filtered through the cabin windows as Sarah moved quietly through her daily routines, her hands steady as she prepared breakfast. The silence between them had grown comfortable over the past weeks, no longer filled with the awkwardness of strangers, but with the peaceful understanding of two souls learning to communicate beyond words. Thomas sat at the rough-hewn table, watching her graceful movements. He had learned to read the subtle language of her expressions, the way her shoulders relaxed when she felt safe, how her eyes brightened when she discovered something that pleased her. Yesterday, when she had successfully started a fire on her own, her smile had lit up the entire room. She set his plate before him with gentle care, their fingers brushing briefly as she withdrew her hand. The touch sent warmth through both of them, a connection that needed no voice to express its meaning. Thomas nodded his thanks, and Sarah responded with that soft smile that had become precious to him. Outside, snow continued to fall steadily, blanketing their small world in pristine white. The isolation that had once felt threatening now felt protective, as if nature itself was giving them this time to discover each other without the judgment of others. Sarah moved to the window, pressing her palm against the cool glass as she watched the flakes dance in the wind. Thomas joined her there, standing close enough that she could feel his warmth. He pointed to the horizon where the storm seemed to be clearing, then made gentle gestures that she had learned meant hope, future, together. Sarah nodded, understanding flowing between them like a river finding its natural course towards something beautiful and lasting. The storm had passed, leaving the world crystalline and bright, but with the clearing skies came an unwelcome visitor. Sarah heard the hoofbeats first, her body tensing as she recognized the aggressive rhythm. Through the window, she watched Sheriff Morrison dismount, his face twisted with the familiar sneer she remembered from town. Thomas emerged from the barn, sensing trouble in the way animals sense approaching storms. The sheriff's mouth moved in harsh words that Sarah couldn't hear from inside, but she could read the anger in his gestures, the way he pointed toward the cabin with accusation. Her heart hammered as memories flooded back the cruel laughter when she had been rejected, the whispered comments about her strangeness, the way decent folk had turned their backs. She pressed herself against the wall, feeling small and vulnerable once again. But then Thomas did something that changed everything. He stepped between the sheriff and the cabin, his massive frame a wall of protection. His hands moved in firm, deliberate gestures not pleading or explaining, but commanding. The sheriff's bluster seemed to deflate against Thomas's quiet authority. When Morrison finally remounted and rode away, muttering curses into the wind, Thomas turned toward the cabin. Through the window, Sarah saw something in his eyes she had never seen directed at her before: fierce protectiveness, as if she were something precious worth defending. As our characters face this first real test from the outside world, I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from right now? And what challenges are you facing in your own life that require quiet strength to overcome? Thomas opened the door and found Sarah trembling. Without hesitation, he crossed to her and gently took her hands in his work-roughened ones, his touch speaking louder than any words could. You are safe. You belong here. You are wanted. In the days following the sheriff's visit, something fundamental shifted between them. Sarah no longer flinched when Thomas moved suddenly, and he began to include her in small decisions about their daily life: where to hang the dried herbs, how to arrange the firewood, which animals needed tending first. The cabin felt different now, charged with an energy that neither could name but both recognized. When Sarah cooked, Thomas would stand nearby, not hovering but present, as if her safety had become his primary concern. When he worked on repairs, she would bring him coffee and stay to watch, fascinated by the careful precision of his hands. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Sarah picked up a piece of wood and began to carve. Thomas watched in amazement as her fingers shaped a small bird, delicate and perfect. She had never mentioned this skill, this hidden talent that revealed depths he was only beginning to discover. He gestured toward the carving, then toward her, his expression full of wonder and question. Sarah blushed, understanding his curiosity. She pointed to herself, then made the motion of being small, hiding. Her hands shaped the memory of being alone, finding solace in creating beauty when the world offered her none. Thomas nodded with deep comprehension. He reached for his own piece of wood and began to carve, his movements careful and deliberate. Slowly, a flower emerged under his patient hands. When he finished, he placed it beside her bird, two lonely creatures now paired together. The symbolism was not lost on either of them. In the warm glow of the firelight, surrounded by the silence that had once separated them but now united them, They began to understand that sometimes the most profound communications happen without words, and that love often grows strongest in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. Spring arrived with a rush of melting snow and budding hope, but it also brought unwelcome news. A letter arrived from town, delivered by a nervous boy who wouldn't meet Thomas's eyes. Sarah watched her husband's face darken as he read the official words, though she couldn't hear the paper crackling in his trembling hands. The message was clear. Even without sound, the town council questioned their marriage, demanded Sarah's appearance to verify her status. Some claimed a deaf man couldn't properly care for a wife, that their union was irregular, perhaps even invalid. Sarah felt the familiar cold fear creeping up her spine, the same terror that had gripped her when she'd first been rejected at the train station. But this time was different. This time she had something worth fighting for. She moved to Thomas's side and gently took the letter from his hands. Reading the cruel words, she felt anger kindle in her chest, not the helpless rage of a victim, but the fierce protectiveness of a woman defending her home and the man she had come to love. Thomas began to gesture frantically, pointing toward town, his movements sharp with frustration and worry. He feared for her, she realized. He thought she might want to leave, to escape the judgment that would inevitably come. Sarah placed her hands over his, stilling his anxious movements. Looking directly into his eyes, she shook her head firmly. Then, with deliberate care, she picked up the letter and walked to the fireplace. Without hesitation, she fed it to the flames. The paper curled and blackened, taking with it the power of others to define their happiness. Thomas stared at her in amazement, seeing perhaps for the first time the steel beneath her gentle exterior, the strength that had carried her through rejection and loneliness to find her way to love. The confrontation came 3 days later. Sarah had prepared herself, wearing her best dress and braiding her hair with careful precision. When the town council arrived with Sheriff Morrison, she stood beside Thomas on their porch, no longer the frightened woman who had once cowered at harsh words. Councilman Phillips dismounted first, his pompous bearing making Sarah's jaw tighten. His mouth moved in what she knew were condescending questions about her welfare, her satisfaction with the arrangement, whether she felt trapped or coerced. Thomas began to respond with sharp gestures, but Sarah stepped forward, surprising everyone. She had practiced these words, formed them carefully in her mind during the sleepless nights since the letter arrived. "My husband," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the yard despite its gentle tone, "treats me with more kindness and respect than any hearing man in your town ever showed me. He sees me when others looked right through me. He values my thoughts when others dismissed me as damaged goods." The men shifted uncomfortably, perhaps remembering their own cruel laughter, their own part in her rejection. Sarah continued, her confidence growing with each word. "You question whether a deaf man can care for a wife, but I question whether hearing men who mock the vulnerable deserve respect themselves. Thomas has given me a home where I am cherished, not tolerated." As these two people find the courage to stand up for their love against judgment, I'm wondering where you're listening from tonight, and if you've ever had to defend something precious to you against those who couldn't understand its value. Sarah reached for Thomas's hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. The simple gesture spoke louder than any argument. Here was love, real and chosen and worth defending against the narrow minds of those who would rather see others diminished than expanded. The silence that followed Sarah's words was deafening in its own way. Even Sheriff Morrison seemed taken aback by the quiet strength in her voice, the dignity that radiated from her small frame. Councilman Phillips cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with having his authority challenged by someone he had dismissed as insignificant. But then something unexpected happened. Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife who had ridden with them, stepped forward. Sarah remembered her as one of the few who had shown kindness during those awful days after her rejection. "I've seen them in town," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice carrying across the yard. "They come for supplies together, and I've never seen a woman look more content or a man more devoted. Perhaps we should concern ourselves with marriages that truly need intervention, rather than ones that clearly don't." Thomas squeezed Sarah's hand, and she could feel his amazement at this unexpected support. Other voices began to murmur agreement, the blacksmith nodding, the young pastor who had been silent until now speaking up about the Christian duty to support love rather than judge it. Sarah watched the tide turning, saw the council members' certainty wavering. She realized that their happiness had been visible to those willing to see it, that their love story had touched hearts even when they thought no one was watching. Councilman Phillips, clearly outnumbered and embarrassed, gathered his remaining authority. "This matter appears resolved," he said stiffly. We trust you'll continue to be productive members of our community. As the group prepared to leave, Sarah felt a profound shift in her understanding of belonging. She had spent so long believing she was unwanted that she had missed the quiet supporters who had been watching and hoping for her happiness all along. 1 year later, Sarah stood in the same spot where she had once defended their love. But now she was watching Thomas teach their neighbor's young son how to carve. The boy was deaf like Thomas, and his parents had brought him seeking guidance from the man who had proven that silence was no barrier to a full life. Sarah's hand rested on her growing belly, feeling the flutter of new life within. The baby would be born into a world where love was measured not by words spoken, but by actions taken, where strength was found in gentleness and wisdom flourished in quiet moments. The town had changed too, in small but meaningful ways. Mrs. Henderson had learned simple hand gestures to communicate with Thomas at the store. The pastor had invited them to help teach other families about understanding differences rather than fearing them. Thomas looked up from his carving lesson and caught Sarah's eye. His smile held all the words he couldn't speak: gratitude for the woman who had seen past his silence to his heart, wonder at the family they were creating together, contentment with the life they had built from rejection and loneliness. As our story of quiet love reaches its end, I'm curious to know where you are in the world right now, and what this tale of finding belonging in unexpected places means to you in your own journey. Sarah moved to join them, settling beside Thomas with the easy grace of a woman who had found her home. The carved bird and flower they had made that first night still sat on the mantel, but now they were surrounded by an entire menagerie of wooden creatures, a family of carvings reflecting the family of the heart they had created together, where silence spoke volumes and love needed no voice to make itself known. The train whistle pierced the morning air like a knife, its echo bouncing off the mountains that surrounded Cedar Ridge Station. Sarah clutched her small carpetbag tighter, her knuckles white against the worn leather handle, as she stepped onto the wooden platform. The advertisement had promised a new beginning, a chance for a quiet woman to find her place in the world. Mr. Garrett was supposed to meet her here. She had memorized his description from his letters: tall, brown hair, kind eyes. But as the other passengers dispersed and the platform emptied, Sarah remained alone, her heart sinking with each passing minute. The station master, a gruff man with tobacco-stained teeth, approached with obvious reluctance. "Got a telegram for you, miss," he said, avoiding her eyes. "Your intended, well, he's changed his mind. Says a woman who can't speak up proper ain't what he needs for frontier life." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She had been honest about her quiet nature, her preference for silence over meaningless chatter. She had thought it would be seen as a virtue, not a failing. As winter's first snow began to fall around this abandoned train station, I wonder where in the world you're listening from, and whether you've ever felt completely alone in a crowd of strangers. Standing there with nowhere to go and no money for return passage, Sarah felt the familiar shame washing over her. Once again, she had been found wanting, too strange and silent for a world that valued loud voices over gentle hearts. The mountains loomed around her like prison walls, and the snow continued to fall, covering her dreams in cold, white silence. Sarah had been sitting on the station bench for 3 hours when she heard the heavy footsteps approaching. Through the swirling snow, a massive figure emerged, a man so tall and broad, he seemed carved from the mountains themselves. His long black hair was braided with leather, and his face bore the weathered lines of someone who spent his days under the open sky. He stopped before her, and Sarah noticed something unusual. When he spoke, his hands moved in deliberate patterns, shaping words in the air that she didn't understand. His voice, when it came, was careful and deep, each word formed with obvious effort. "You need help," he said, the words slightly slurred but unmistakably kind. His dark eyes held a gentleness that seemed at odds with his imposing size. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. She gestured toward her bag, then toward the empty platform, trying to convey her situation without words. Something flickered in the man's expression, recognition, perhaps, or understanding born of his own struggles with communication. "I am Thomas," he said, touching his chest. Then he pointed to his ears and shook his head, explaining his condition with simple honesty. "You stay here, die," he continued, gesturing toward the storm that was growing stronger. "As Sarah sits in this blizzard facing an impossible choice, I'm curious what time it is where you are right now, and whether you're somewhere warm and safe tonight." Thomas extended his hand toward her, palm up, patient and unthreatening. In his eyes, Sarah saw something she had never expected to find: acceptance without judgment. an invitation to safety that asked for nothing in return except the courage to trust a stranger who understood what it meant to be different. The cabin appeared through the snow like something from a dream. Built of sturdy logs and nestled against a protective ridge, it glowed with warm yellow light from its windows. Sarah followed Thomas up the path, her feet numb with cold but her heart unexpectedly lighter than it had been in months. Inside, the warmth enveloped her like an embrace. The single room was simply furnished but immaculately clean, with handmade furniture that spoke of careful craftsmanship and pride. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the scent of pine and wood smoke filled the air. Thomas gestured for her to sit near the fire, then moved with surprising grace for such a large man to prepare tea. Sarah watched his careful movements, noting how he checked the kettle's vibration rather than listening for the whistle, how he used touch and sight to navigate his silent world. When he brought her the steaming cup, their fingers brushed briefly. The contact sent an unexpected warmth through Sarah, different from the heat of the fire. Thomas seemed to feel it too, for he paused, his dark eyes searching her face with gentle curiosity. "You safe here," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Storm, pass. Tomorrow, decide." Sarah nodded, understanding that he was offering her time and space to choose her own path. No demands, no expectations, just shelter from the storm and the freedom to determine her own future. It was more kindness than anyone had shown her in years. As the wind howled outside and the fire painted dancing shadows on the walls, Sarah felt something she had almost forgotten: the possibility of belonging somewhere, with someone who understood that silence could be its own form of communication, and that sometimes the most profound connections happened without words. Sarah woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the sound of chopping wood echoing from outside. She had slept in Thomas's bed while he took the floor, and the kindness of that gesture wasn't lost on her. No man had ever sacrificed his own comfort for hers without expecting something in return. She dressed quickly and emerged to find Thomas splitting logs with methodical precision. His movements were powerful but controlled, each swing of the axe speaking to years of hard work and self-reliance. When he noticed her watching, he set down the tool and approached with that same careful gentleness she was beginning to associate with him. "You stay," he said, the words more question than statement. His hands moved as he spoke, and Sarah found herself wishing she understood the graceful language of his gestures. The practical part of her mind catalogued her options. She had no money for train fare, no family to return to, no prospects waiting in some distant city. But there was something else, something harder to define, that made her consider his offer. In Thomas's presence, she felt seen in a way that had nothing to do with being judged or found wanting. She nodded slowly and watched relief flood his features. He pointed to himself, then to her, then made a gesture that seemed to encompass the cabin, the clearing, the mountains beyond. Home, his expression seemed to say. This could be home for both of us. That afternoon, Thomas showed her around the property: the small garden plot, the chicken coop, the stream that provided fresh water. Everything was tidy and well-maintained, the work of a man who took pride in creating order from wilderness. Sarah began to see how she might fit into this life, how her quiet nature might be an asset rather than a liability in a place where actions mattered more than words. 3 weeks passed like pages in a gentle book, each day bringing small discoveries and growing comfort. Sarah learned the rhythms of Thomas's life: how he rose before dawn to tend the animals, how he checked the weather by reading the sky and wind, how he carved small wooden figures by the fire each evening. She contributed in her own quiet ways, cooking meals that brought surprised pleasure to his face, mending his clothes with careful stitches, organizing the cabin with a woman's eye for efficiency and beauty. They developed their own language of gestures and glances, understanding growing between them like a bridge built stone by careful stone. One morning, as Sarah prepared breakfast, Thomas approached the stove and stood close behind her, not touching but near enough that she could feel his warmth. He reached around her to point at the skillet, then made gestures she was beginning to recognize as praise. "Good," his hands seemed to say. "Very good." Sarah turned within the circle of his arms, suddenly aware of how natural this felt. How right. Their eyes met and held, and something shifted in the air between them. Thomas raised one hand slowly, gently touching her cheek with fingers that trembled slightly despite their strength. In the growing warmth of the kitchen, surrounded by the simple domestic scene they had created together, "I wonder where you're joining us from today, and what small moments of connection are bringing joy to your own life." Neither spoke, but words weren't necessary. In Thomas's touch, Sarah felt acceptance, protection, and something deeper that she was only beginning to name. When he stepped back, giving her space to breathe and think, she knew that what was growing between them was more than convenience or companionship. It was the beginning of love, patient and true and worth the wait.